All right, so let's go ahead and get started then. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sydney Hoyle, Associate Director of Graduate Programs Enrollment here at the Tippie College of Business. I'm going to be moderating today's event. You are here for an Executive MBA Masterclass on recognizing and addressing job burnout with Professor and Director of Executive Education Stephen Courtright. Today, you're going to hear a lot from Steve on this topic, but you'll also have several opportunities to ask questions throughout the class. So before we dive in, I'll be turning it over to Dawn Kluber. And Dawn is our Executive Director of the Executive MBA Program. Dawn is a Iowa undergraduate alum with an MBA from Case Western Reserve. Prior to joining Tippie, Dawn worked for GE, Motorola, and the global architecture firm Perkins and Will. So Dawn, thank you for being here. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm really happy to see current EMBA students on our list of attendees, as well as some alums and students who are going to start in August. And then, of course, all others who are interested in this topic, which is really timely. I am really pleased to be introducing Professor Steve Courtright. I wrote this introduction down because I didn't want to miss anything. So here we go. Stephen Courtright is the Henry B. Tippie Professor of Management and Director of the Executive Education at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business. He's also the founding director of the Tippie Leadership Collaborative, which provides customized executive and managerial training for organizations across Iowa and the U.S. A former accountant, or reformed accountant, perhaps we can say, he received his BS in accounting from Brigham Young University, Idaho, and a PhD in business administration from the University of Iowa. He previously served as an assistant and associate professor of management at Texas A&M University, where he was named a Presidential Impact Fellow before returning to Iowa in 2020. His award-winning research on organizational leadership, team effectiveness, and employee engagement has been published in top research journals and cited over 5,000 times. He's been a guest on NPR, Sirius XM Business Radio, and HuffPost Live, and his work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and other media outlets. He's delivered more than 50 presentations to academic audiences around the world, and he currently serves on the editorial boards of 3 major research journals. Professor Courtright currently teaches courses on organizational behavior and leadership in Tippie's Executive MBA and undergraduate programs. He received the Great Instructor of the Year award from our EMBA class of 2022. Congratulations, Steve, and has been recognized with several other college and international teaching awards. He's delivered training programs and keynote presentations to thousands of executives and managers in Fortune 500 companies, large government agencies, and small to medium-sized businesses. For his work in directing Tippie's customized executive education team, he received the college's Outstanding Service by a Faculty Member Award. Most importantly, he and his wife, Nicole, are the proud parents of 4 children. Together, they enjoy traveling, exploring the outdoors, watching Hawkeye sports, and serving in their church. Welcome, Steve, and we're really looking forward to this session today.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you, Sydney, as well. I'm really excited to be able to be with each of you here today to talk about, as Dawn said, a very timely topic of job burnout. This is something that in my conversations with organizations almost on a daily basis is top of mind for them. And I'm guessing you're tuning into this today because it's top of mind for you as well. And that could be because you feel you're experiencing burnout. It could be that you're concerned that your employees, if you have a management role, are experiencing burnout. It could be that you have concerns with how your organization may be addressing burnout, or you're just looking for ways to be able to further address burnout in the organization that you're in. Whatever your motive is for being here today, I'm glad to have you here. Welcome, and certainly hope that today's session will be helpful for you as we discuss both the recognizing and the addressing part of job burnout. Now, again, there's probably a variety of reasons why you're here today. Let me tell you one reason why I'm actually here today and why I've been studying burnout for quite a few years now. And then I'll talk about why the world is talking about it, not just here in the EMBA program at University of Iowa. So a few years ago, this is me and my daughter in the picture here. My daughter was in first grade. At the time, we lived in Texas before coming back here to Iowa. And my first grade daughter was begging me to come as the guest of her class's career day. Now, I'm a professor of organizational behavior. I don't believe I've ever met a first grader who ever said, I want to be a professor of organizational behavior when I grow up. And so I was a little nervous. In fact, I was very nervous about this. I felt like I was probably more nervous for this experience than any other teaching experience that I'd ever had. But because she's my daughter and I'm a little wrapped around her finger, I said yes. And so I went to class on that day. And I told them a little bit that I worked at the university, the local university. I told them that I taught Texas A&M students. They really just wanted to talk about Texas A&M football. I was teaching actually the starting quarterback at the time, who was a really popular young man in the community. And so that's probably all these first graders remember the experience. But I was trying to, as often we try to do in our professions, explain to a group of first graders what a professor of organizational behavior does. And so I just started with this, and I just floated this out there to them. I said, what I do is I teach college students how not to be bad bosses. And I just kind of left it at that, just to see what would happen. And about half the students in class raised their hands and started saying, my mom has a bad boss, or my dad hates his boss. And we started having this really interesting conversation about their moms and dads' their moms and dads' bosses. Obviously, the filters are underdeveloped in first grade. So what gets said at the dinner table about the boss goes right through the first grader's ear and right out the mouth to a complete stranger. But as I left that experience, which was really exhilarating, I was thinking about those managers that these children were describing. And I thought to myself, in the years of working with different managers and in managing myself, I don't think any of us have ever said, I hope I'm a bad enough boss that the first grade son or daughter of one of my employees will tell a total stranger about me. But it happens. And what's guided my research is to figure out why it happens. How is it that we, any of us, can be unintentionally become poor bosses? And in the process of discovering that and researching a number of the factors, one of the factors that has really stood out in my research as one of the leading causes of accidental bad boss behavior is burnout. Now, Gallup estimates that in 2021, about 35% of managers felt burned out. And perhaps not surprisingly, but no less astoundingly, that number had jumped from 27% in 2020. And so it's very clear from this and from other surveys that managers are feeling particularly burned out. Now, individual contributors are also feeling burned out. They have not grown in their burnout per se or increased in their burnout to the same degree that managers have, but it's very clear from the data that they are feeling more burned out. We found this time and time again, even in more recent data that we're collecting. So it's very clear that burnout is a major contributor to people's lack of satisfaction, lack of productivity, and in terms of what I study, lack of effective boss behaviors as well. Now, with that in mind, though, this is a worldwide problem. In fact, the World Health Organization declares burnout officially as an occupational health syndrome. Now, why would that be? Well, one reason why it's now declared by WHO as an occupational health syndrome is that the global cost of burnout is estimated to be well over $500 billion a year. And that's before the pandemic. With it increasing during the pandemic, burnout levels, we're probably likely to see that global cost even more. Now, what do those costs entail? Well, a large proportion of the costs of burnout is productivity loss. Things, for example, like reduced job performance or increased errors on the job, or loss of engagement with one's work, or loss of trust in coworkers or in the organization or in managers. Again, in my research, I found that burnout is a leading cause of behaviors such as yelling and screaming at your employees, telling that their work is a quality of a first grader, and other more verbally abusive types of behaviors. It's also predictive of the leader basically just freezing in their role and really just kind of retreating from their leadership responsibilities. It also leads to more turnover and the associated costs with that. The research is also very clear that people who feel burned out actually have a greater propensity. It's not a one-to-one relationship or a perfect correlation by any stretch, but there's a greater propensity to engage in theft and sabotage types of behaviors too. And all of these things cost organizations a significant amount of money. But beyond just what it costs organizations, it also costs the individuals affected by the burnout, which is hence, again, why it is classified by WHO as an occupational health syndrome. For example, people who feel more burned out at work are much more prone to depression, long-term and short-term depressive episodes. They have more memory loss and cognitive degeneration. There's greater incidence of heart disease, and there's also more incidence of alcoholism and other addictive behaviors. And so it's very clear again that the effects of burnout are both costly for individuals and for organizations, and really for societies at large. Now, with that in mind, there have been various misconceptions around burnout, what it is, for example, what its effects are, and also where burnout is most prevalent. There's been a lot of misconceptions, for example, that a lot of the increased burnout levels are due to the millennial generation or the Gen Z generation. As someone who teaches Gen Zers and is on the very old end of millennials myself, I've heard this argument time and time again that it's really just a generational effect. There's also been some speculation that gender plays a role in this, and that actually female employees are more likely to report higher levels of burnout than male employees. And there's also been some industry effects as well. And there's been speculation that there's more higher levels of burnout in some industries versus others. When put to the test, when really kind of viewed through the lens of different studies that have been done on it, what we actually find is that by generation, there's not really a lot of clear evidence that this is just a Gen Z or a millennial issue, but rather that burnout stretches across different generations and that it affects people of all ages in organizations. It's actually the same thing with gender, interestingly enough, too, that men and women are equally susceptible to burnout, and that the extent to which they report feeling burned out is pretty equal. And so there's not as much of a gender effect in this as we oftentimes think there is. Now, industry, that's a different story. When it comes to industry, there are certain industries and types of work where burnout is more prevalent. For example, for 50 years now, we've known that nurses and other medical workers are particularly prone to burnout. They deal with individuals in difficult circumstances, oftentimes in life and death types of situations. For that matter, social workers report high levels of burnout, again, dealing with very difficult situations, oftentimes with life and death situations. Educators as well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, mounting evidence that managers across industries, that type of work of dealing with very important decisions, dealing with difficult things at work, dealing with competing priorities, are contributing to burnout. So there are industry effects, and there's certain types of jobs, again, managerial jobs, where effects of burnout are more prevalent. Now, as we're talking about burnout, though, let's talk about another misconception of burnout. One of the other misconceptions of burnout just deals with how we even use that term. And the misconception is that burnout and stress are the same thing. Well, it turns out the American Psychological Association is in their recent survey on workplace stress says that 79% of people feel stress and anxiety about work. Now, burnout, there's a lower prevalence of that. And so it kind of just begs the question, are stress and burnout the same thing? Does stress and burnout, do they have equally harmful effects? Again, a lot of times we use those terms interchangeably, stress and burnout. What I want to hit home today, just at the beginning, is that stress and burnout are actually different yet related things. And that if we understand burnout, we'll understand that it actually requires a much different treatment than does stress management. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. But to start really figuring out more about what burnout is, let's first talk about it as a syndrome. Let's talk about it like the World Health Organization would, or any medical doctor would. And that's first, let's see what the symptoms are of it. How can we identify if we or others may be experiencing burnout? With that in mind, Over the last 50 years, there has been research on burnout by many, many people, including myself and a few of my colleagues here at Iowa. We've really uncovered three major or primary symptoms of burnout. The core symptom, probably the most apparent one that has been uncovered, is the feeling of emotional exhaustion. This goes beyond just physical exhaustion of feeling kind of used up and worn out at the end of the day, but to feeling like we really have no more emotional or cognitive capacity to lend to work. We essentially feel paralyzed. It's the point where we really just feel, again, like we're frozen, and that we are so exhausted that we can't think, feel, let alone physically do the work. In addition to the feelings of emotional exhaustion and depletion, another key symptom of burnout is cynicism. This is cynicism about not only the people that we work with, but also the people that we serve, or the people or our end customers. Cynicism is one of the other primary symptoms of burnout. And finally, just a loss of confidence, or what researchers call professional efficacy, that feeling that no matter what we do, we cannot accomplish more, or feeling like we're in this hamster wheel of sorts and we're spinning, but we're not getting anywhere. That loss of professional efficacy is another primary symptom of burnout. Now, any of these things can be felt potentially on a given day. But what burnout is it's all of these things at a more chronic level. It's also at a more severe level as well. And so when we're feeling burnout, we're feeling persistent, chronic levels of emotional exhaustion. We're feeling acute and persistent levels of cynicism, and even growing. And we feel even more acute and, again, persistent loss of professional efficacy. And so while stress can certainly be a precursor to burnout, the key differences between stress and burnout are in their severity. Burnout's more severe in nature and in its effects than stress can. In fact, one of the things we'll talk about, stress can be good. Stress can be a positive thing that motivates us and leads us to higher productivity, performance, and even satisfaction and learning on the job. And so there's a key difference between stress and burnout in terms of severity. We have not found any positive outcomes of burnout in the research literature. It's also a difference of longevity. We can feel stressed because there's an impending deadline coming up, or we can feel stressed because we're meeting with a particular client, customer, or we have a particular issue with a coworker. But burnout is something that is more enduring in nature. And so as a result, the treatments are fundamentally different. For stress, pretty simple therapeutics like meditation, recreation, exercise, healthy diets, and a whole list of others are good, and they can be used to treat daily stress. But burnout is more than just daily stress. If we apply the same therapeutics to burnout as we do stress, what we'll end up finding is we're putting a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. Part of the reason for that is that burnout is as much, if not more, an organizational issue as it is an individual issue. And oftentimes we think about with burnout, what we need to do is make sure that people take a vacation, or make sure that people have opportunity to be able to, meditate, or again, exercise. But burnout, again, is as much an organizational issue as an individual issue. And so there's things that organizations can do that are facilitating burnout, and there's things they can do to prevent burnout. And so what we're going to talk about for the duration of our session today is to really dig into what burnout is and what it's not. We'll figure out first what's underlying these symptoms, because it's from there, when we really understand kind of the diagnosis of it, or maybe the underlying cause of the symptoms, that we can really figure out solutions that directly address the burnout, solutions that are pertinent for organizations, and solutions that can be applied by individuals as well. So it's just a little bit now at this point in terms of what the effects of burnout are, probably some context into why we and others are talking about it so much, and the key differences between stress and burnout. With that, I want to pause for just about like 5 minutes or so, just to take any questions that perhaps may be coming in either on the chat or that people want to raise. And I'm grateful to Sydney for facilitating that Q&A. So again, questions for about 5 minutes, and then I'll move on to the next part of it where we really dig into what burnout is and what are some of the solutions for combating it.
Yeah, and so we haven't had any come in yet. So the best place to put those questions is going to be the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have questions, please feel free to drop those there.
Maybe I'll just like pause for maybe just about 30 seconds or so for any questions come in. And if there's not, great, I'll move forward, but I did just want to pause again at this point for any questions that might come up up to this point.
All right, so we do have one question that's come in.
Great.
So what is the best way to communicate with our employer if we do believe that we may be burning out?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that when it comes to communicate with employers, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, oftentimes one of the things to communicate with employers is that difference between stress and burnout. I think so much of the time, because we use those terms interchangeably, when we tell a manager or when we tell an executive, I'm feeling burned out, what they're really hearing is I'm stressed out about my work. And what we really need to communicate is the severity and the longevity part of it. So I think when we communicate that, that just makes it very clear that this is more than just, hey, I'm feeling stressed because I got a deadline. This is true burnout. That's the first step in effectively communicating this up whatever channel that you need to communicate.
Wonderful. Okay. Another question. What are some important indicators as the transition from stress to burnout occurs?
Yeah, so when it comes to the indicators, the first thing, if we just go back to the slide here, the first thing we oftentimes feel when we're having burnout is that emotional exhaustion. That's why we oftentimes call it that core symptom. And so we may feel emotionally exhausted, but when we feel that that's persisting, when that's not just a weekend won't solve it, for example, or a short vacation, even a long vacation won't solve it, that's one of those indicators that the stress has become burnout. But following that emotional exhaustion, when we start feeling really cynical, and then when we start feeling that loss of professional efficacy, these actually work kind of in sequential order is what the research shows on this. And so the tipping point, if you will, when it becomes burnout is when the emotional exhaustion is persistent, followed by those feelings of cynicism. And then because of that cynicism, that loss of professional efficacy or that loss of confidence. So that's, again, where I would sort of start seeing where the stress is becoming the burnout. The major point, though, is when the exhaustion is not solved by a weekend or is not solved by a vacation. That's when you know that you're starting to transition to burnout.
Wonderful. So, I mean, we have a few more questions, but would you like to keep going and then answer those toward the end?
That sounds good. Absolutely. Yeah. Why don't I keep going here? Thanks for those 2 questions, by the way. Excellent questions. And maybe some of the other questions that you have will be answered by some of the content that I'll be presenting now. And if they're not, like Sydney said, more than happy to take questions here at the end too. But let's start digging into what burnout really is, what's underlying some of these symptoms that we discussed earlier, the emotional exhaustion, the cynicism, the loss of professional efficacy. In essence, when it comes to burnout, what's really happening is pictured here on the slide, and it's just kind of a process model here. In essence, the definition of burnout is that when the demands that we face, and those demands can be at work, but they can also be outside of work and combining with demands at work. And when those demands exceed our psychological resources that we usually draw on to address demands. And so the definition is a bit of an equation. When demands are greater than resources, burnout occurs. When demands are less than resources, we may feel stress, but we won't necessarily feel the burnout. Now, when there's an imbalance in the equation of demands exceeding psychological resources, what we typically feel as individuals is we feel that either anger or anxiety, or oftentimes a mix of both, which then behaviorally often leads us to kind of a fight, flight, or freeze response. On the other hand, Demands and stress can be good if we've got psychological resources that enable us to address those demands effectively. When that happens, demands can actually energize us. And when they energize us, then what we do is we engage with those demands more. It reminds me years ago when I started researching burnout that I was talking to a manager of a fairly large business that was becoming an even larger business. And so the managers there at the business were having to take on some additional demands and responsibilities that were associated with this transitioning to growing the business. And I remember talking to the owner of the business, and I remember asking him how things were going in this transition and in this growth phase. And the comment to me was, I see some of my managers really thriving in the new conditions. They're taking these new demands and they're just more energized and engaged than I've ever seen them before. But on the other hand, there's this other group of managers who, to quote him, were burned out and bottomed out. The demands were relatively similar across the managers. What differed was the resources that they had, those psychological resources, and they in turn elicited very, very different responses. So again, the definition of burnout is when the demands we face exceed the psychological resources that we have to address those. Now, I've thrown out this term psychological resources. What exactly is that? Let's just define that just a little bit more. In the research on psychological resources and as it relates to burnout, there's three major ones that I'll cover in our presentation today. They are the feelings of efficacy or competence, their feelings of social support, and their feelings of control or autonomy. When those resources, again, exceed demands, those demands can be energizing and engaging. On the other hand, when the demands exceed our efficacy or our support or our control, then our emotional response is more negative, as are our behaviors. That's what I call the DESC model of burnout. The DESC is really an acronym that stands for what I'm going to talk to you about now, the different levers that we can pull to be able to better address burnout. I do compare these to levers. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to address the core of the problem. We're not just trying to address the symptoms, we're trying to address the core. And the core is that the demands are exceeding the resources. And so the DESC method, again, offers us some different tools or levers to pull to be able to better address the burnout. We may pull one of those levers. We may pull all of them. We may pull a combination of two or three of them. But each of these provide, in essence, a menu of options by which to address burnout, both organizationally as well as individually. And so we have a few different options. We can either pull the demands lever, we can pull the efficacy lever, we can pull the support lever, or we can pull the control lever. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about a few different ways in which we might be able to pull those levers. In other words, we might be able to manage demands, or that we might be able to replenish our resources of efficacy, support, and control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these one by one, and we're going to talk about each of these different levers. And what I want you to be thinking about as I do this is, what have you done in the past to pull that lever yourself? And or what do you think could be done in your organization or by you as an individual to better pull this particular lever? Again, look at this as a menu of options by which to address burnout. Let's start with demands. I have a colleague here at University of Iowa, Ian Crawford. He and I actually just did a talk of Iowa on Iowa Public Radio show, just a segment on that was aired yesterday about burnout. And when we talked about burnout, he referred to a really interesting study that he just published in a journal called Organization Science. In essence, what they wanted to find out was, how do you keep your most proactive employees? Proactive employees have a lot of desirable characteristics. They're the ones we oftentimes have to manage least. They're the ones coming up with the most new ideas most frequently. They're the ones who are willing to take on tasks, that are willing to do things without having to be asked first. Again, they're kind of our ideal employees. Those are the employees we want to have. And he wanted to find out, how do we best keep those kinds of employees? But on the flip side, how is it that we can lose those employees? And so what he did was he looked at various factors that might cause proactive employees to leave or to stay. And what was interesting about the study is that he found that for proactive employees, they did like new challenges. They liked new things. They were proactively oftentimes seeking out those challenges, and they enjoyed and thrived on those challenges. But what was most likely to cause them to leave, those challenges was an influencer for them to stay. What caused them to leave is when they felt what Ian called in his study and what has been called in other studies, hindrance demands. These are things like bureaucratic red tape or office politics. There are also things like administrative hassles or other things that really don't aid toward goal accomplishment and actually are perceived generally as obstacles to progress. And what he found is that the quickest way to lose your proactive employees is to have more of these hindrance demands. And the people who are more likely to stick it out in the face of these hindrance demands are the non-proactive employees. So one of the implications of his study is simply this, is that in order to help people manage demands, to pull that particular lever, it's incumbent on us as managers to remove obstacles to people's progress the very best that we can anyway. And so there's a few simple ways to go about doing this. I say simple to just start the conversation, not always simple to solve, but simple to start solving it. And that is to engage in some dialogue with our employees. And it can be as simple, that dialogue, as asking this question: if there's anything, is there anything getting in your way of accomplishing goals at work? Or what can I take away or change that would help you be happier, more satisfied, and more productive at work? A lot of times when organizations try to treat burnout, what they do is they introduce more. They introduce new programs, new initiatives, and those can often be beneficial. But sometimes what we don't focus on is what can we take away? What can we help people have less of that's more stressful and that doesn't result in goal accomplishment? And so part of managing demands, a big part of it, is removing obstacles to progress. So for ourselves, if we're experiencing burnout, it was asked earlier, how do we have this conversation? Sometimes it's being able to identify those demands that are more obstacles to progress than challenges. Again, as we're even facing our own burnout and we start having that dialogue with people in the organization, they may automatically hear burnout and think stress. But if we can clearly distinguish between those two, and then clearly distinguish between those demands that are hindering progress versus those that are aiding progress, that can be helpful in starting that dialogue as well and finding some really convergent goals to be able to address burnout. Now, the other thing we can also do to be able to remove obstacles to progress is, as we're facing demands, to be able to, what I like to call, shrink the challenge a little bit. A lot of times when we see that when we're looking at a demand, we're looking at it for such a long-term lens that we don't oftentimes break up that challenge into kind of bite-sized chunks. And so sometimes a way to manage our own burnout by managing demands is simply by shrinking the challenge and tackling one thing at a time. One of the things I do with my students, for example, is at the beginning of every class, we do a zoom out before we zoom in onto the content. A zoom out meaning, here's what we've done so far in the class, and we've got a lot of content that we cover in my class, and here's where we're going today. That helps to kind of just put things into perspective, and it makes us feel like progress is happening. It turns out that that feeling of progress is also one of the best things we can do to address burnout. And that gets to the next lever that we can pull, which is around efficacy. In a really large-scale study done by some researchers at Carnegie Mellon and a few other universities, and it's captured in a book that I would recommend for you, and it's by Teresa Amabile, who's now at Harvard, and it's called The Progress Principle. In a very large-scale study, they wanted to find out what kept people engaged at work, what prevented burnout. And in their study, one of the number one factors that came out was the ability for people to feel that they were making daily progress toward an end goal. And so As managers, oftentimes what we do is we're so, myself included, I'm so consumed with what has to be done today that I'm not doing things to really create and celebrate the small wins and progress that we've made already. Or as an individual, I find my to-do list growing and I add to my to-do list so that by the time I leave work, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, I feel like my to-do list is bigger than the one that I left with. Well, I have a colleague here at work who came up with a really great strategy for being able to create and celebrate small wins, both as an individual as well as a leader of research teams. She keeps what's called a done list. It's a little bit different than a to-do list. The to-do list represents gaps in terms of where we're at toward goal accomplishment. But a done list captures what we've accomplished in the process of done list. In other words, it enables us to be able to see the progress, that daily progress we've made. And what she does is for herself, she keeps a done list that she reviews at the end of each day. And for her research team, depending on the life cycle of the project, but oftentimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, depending on the project, she will send out the done list. That's a fantastic strategy for creating and building small wins and for building confidence that we're going to accomplish the end goal. That's one way in which to create greater efficacy at work. Let me tell you about one other interesting way as well to create efficacy at work. And that is the power of following a morning routine. I have a former PhD student of mine who recently published a study. He's at University of Oklahoma now, where what he looked at was if people follow a regular routine in the morning, does that make them more productive and more satisfied and feeling like they've made daily progress during the day? And there was very, very clear evidence that that was the case. So whether that morning routine involved coffee or whether that morning routine involved reading or exercise or whatever that morning routine involved, what he found is that there's sort of a carryover effect of following a morning routine and then being able to have that carryover into greater productivity at work. Why? They discovered because if we follow a morning routine, it's a quick win. It's a quick, small win in our day, and it builds confidence, and that confidence has some carryover effects. So from an individual standpoint, we can establish morning routines to follow that give us a quick win during the day. As managers, it's allowing people to have a morning routine. Maybe that deals with then when we schedule meetings, or maybe that deals with how we structure work or the flexibility we give. But either way, following morning routines can be a great way to just build some initial confidence during our day, in addition to the tool of keeping a done list for us and for our teams. Now, as we're talking about teams, let's also talk about then the next lever to pull to address burnout, and that's that support lever. Really, when it comes to support, we're talking about communicating and connecting with our team. Now, most often, when we talk about support at work, we often equate this with things like support groups, focus groups at work, or with team lunches or team building exercises and things like that. And certainly it can, and certainly those may be able to help. However, what we're learning more and more when it comes to modern teams, especially teams that are more remote in nature, is that support is most often felt in more task-oriented ways than anything else. Now, there's a few reasons for this. One is that in remote teams, we just simply have less time to interface, which means people are much more attuned to tasks than relationships more naturally in remote or virtual work. But the other thing we're discovering in research too is that people are often afraid of more close relationships at work and unwilling to reveal their true, authentic selves. This is especially true in more traditionally underrepresented groups, it turns out from research. And so to connect and communicate with our teams, that doesn't just mean have a team retreat or a team building exercise, though again, that may be helpful. It may just being able to find, the support may be found in just being able to start finding shared meaning in our work. By that, what I mean is by helping people connect on elements of the work that are personally meaningful for them. For example, as managers, we may be able to ask our people what they care about most in their work. Perhaps it's the product itself, or maybe it's the customers that they work with. Maybe they care about the industry. Maybe they care about the organization's mission. But being able to find out what people care about most in their work is much less, I guess, threatening sometimes than what people care about in their non-work lives. Even though, again, it can be helpful to know what people care about in their non-work lives, we can start anyway with shared meaning at work. And then be able to see the connection between their meanings at work and the meaning that we get from work, or the meaning that an individual contributor gets at work with what other individual contributors in our team are seeing at work. And so we can start connecting by being able to simply find shared meanings. Where is it that people find important in their work, and how do they share that importance? Now, the other thing too that we can do is we can communicate in the right way. So one of the misconceptions that we oftentimes have around communicating in that support is that more is better. And so this might mean holding more meetings, or I've experienced it before, where we say, let's get together in the evening for a virtual, get together of some kind. But I think what we're finding in the pandemic, and one study by Microsoft really brings this out, is that the time that people spend in meetings has more than doubled during the pandemic. And it's contributing to a new type of fatigue, a fatigue that you and I are probably familiar with and that you've heard of before. And that is the Zoom fatigue, or sometimes what people call always on fatigue. Communicating does not necessarily mean more meetings. In fact, some things we can do to communicate and show even greater support with our teams is things like not just scheduling the default 1 hour block for a Zoom meeting, but being able to schedule in transition time between meetings for people to support people in doing simple things like using the restroom, or stretching, or walking their dog, or taking their dog out to go to the bathroom, whatever it might be. We can also show support by having clear agendas and a clear purpose behind every meeting. Sometimes when people are feeling particularly fatigued by this Zoom fatigue, or always on fatigue, research has shown that if we allow people and support people in turning their cameras off, especially in teams where we know each other well, that supporting people and turning their camera off can be a great way to communicate that support to individuals. So the biggest thing, again, with support is it's not just about team building or team lunches or, again, support groups. It's also just about connecting around shared meetings and communicating support through task-oriented means. That's one other lever that we can pull to help prevent burnout. Let's talk about the final one, and then I'll take questions there at the end too. And that is the control lever. We have known for a long time that autonomy and this feeling of control is one of the basic psychological human needs that we have. And yet, during the pandemic especially, most employees report feeling less control and power over their work, especially as we get into managerial positions. As one author put it, who was quoting another manager, it's actually one of the readings we do in my class. Sometimes we can feel like a hostage to others in terms of our time, in terms of our competing priorities, and in terms of our tasks. And so a lot of times when we become managers, we feel more at the mercy of others, and we lose a certain sense of control or power over our work. That takes away from our well-being at work, and as we've noted, can be a major contributor toward burnout. This is particularly true as we now start having blurred boundaries between home and work, because the notion always was is maybe I have less control at work, but I have much more control at home. But as those become more blurred, we can oftentimes find just general perceptions of less control. And so working from home does not always equal more autonomy. It takes effort and it takes purpose to really be able to define our boundaries and establish clear boundaries, for example, around when we're working and when we're not working. So a few suggestions in that regard. For us as individuals, it can be that we maybe customize our workspace and our workflow at home a little bit. It could be, for example, that we communicate, as I've often had to do with my 4 children at home, as Dawn mentioned earlier, that when I have my headphones on and the doors closed, that's my work time. I've even have a sign that I put outside the door if I'm doing deep work at home. Deep work for me is oftentimes doing research. So I can do that, or I can customize my workflow in such a way that it defines those boundaries. Maybe I take care of emails when I know there's going to be more disruption, but more deep work when I know that I can minimize disruption. We can also allow other people to do the same thing as well, to allow them to define and communicate their boundaries around work too. The research is pretty clear that the more that we expect of people outside of traditional work hours, the more likely they are to feel that the demands exceed resources. And so as a team, we can coalesce around what are the boundaries that we will set as a team, but also allow for boundaries at the individual level too. The other thing we can do to help people feel more control is that especially with remote work, and I know I keep referring to remote work, but it's just such a reality for all of us. And again, we find burnout levels really catapulting because of remote work really increasing. That what we do as managers is we feel ourselves a sense of loss of control. And what we know from research on control is that when we feel loss of control, we try to regain that control. And oftentimes what that translates into is more micromanagement types of behaviors. And so one of the managerial tools we can use to be able to address burnout is checking up versus checking in. Checking up implies a sort of, I don't really trust you. And so you need to report to me what you're doing. It implies more monitoring and surveillance versus checking in implies more, how can I help? What are the resources that you need? How can I remove this obstacle? And micromanagement, it turns out, can really increase burnout because it gives us a sense of less control. And so in essence, by checking in versus checking up, what we're doing is we're defining boundaries in terms of our influence on the process of work. And so again, checking in versus checking up can be a great tool also for being able to manage and prevent burnout. Now, we've talked about these 4 levers. Again, I call this the DESK method because of the acronym there. As we're looking to address burnout, we can pull any one of these levers. We may pull a combination of them. We may need to pull all of them. And they can be pulled as we manage it in the organization level. We can also pull these as we manage it at our own individual level as well. We can manage our demands. Remember that by managing demands, if we scroll back earlier, it's removing obstacles to progress. We can create and celebrate small wins to fill our resource of efficacy. We can communicate and connect with our team, especially in task-oriented ways, to refill our support resource. And finally, we can define our boundaries to be able to achieve and feel more control over our work. In combination, each of these things are evidence-based ways in which to address and manage burnout. We've seen earlier that this is a strategic imperative of organizations. And I hope that this presentation has been helpful for you to have some tools for managing your own, as well as helping to manage other people's burnout. Thanks again for your time today and for letting me present these evidence-based concepts to you. And with that, we have quite a few minutes for me to take questions, and I'll be glad to answer them.
Well, that is convenient because we have quite a few questions.
Great.
All right. So that was some great content. I definitely took some notes myself here. Okay. So few questions that have come in. So this person is they're starting a new or I'm sorry, their company has been acquired by another company. It's been a rough transition for them personally. They're trying to identify whether it's burnout that they're going through or whether it's kind of those run-of-the-mill growing pains. You know, does the company have a burnout latent culture or is it just a difficult transition?
That is a great question. And honestly, I do feel like that there's a fine line there. There can be certain situations that really spike that level of stress and burnout, and particularly mergers and acquisitions are some of the most stress-inducing experiences that we can have in organizations as we're trying to figure out how do we work with shared services, or how is it that we can, navigate new faces and new processes and things. Here is what I would suggest in that way, is that oftentimes when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, there's certainly kind of a period of time where the stress is more acute. And so my personal suggestion is let's work through that time of the adjustment period. This is kind of like, it's the equivalent of bringing a baby home, and during the first 6 months is typically more stressful than the other 6 months, because you sort of figure out how to get things, how to do things, you get into a routine and you settle into that routine. And so don't react too quickly if it's a big merger and acquisition. But at the same time, use that test that we used earlier. As you go through that transition, if the weekend doesn't solve it, if a vacation doesn't solve it, and that emotional exhaustion persists, and then we start growing in that cynicism, and then we start growing in that loss of professional efficacy, it's a surefire bet that what we're experiencing is burnout. And so again, look for those symptoms there. Look for, especially in this case, because you'll probably feel more exhausted than other times, the cynicism and the loss of professional efficacy. That's when you know, and you can be better sure that it's actually burnout, not stress.
All right, that's some great advice. Okay. So do you often see a correlation between burnout and engagement? So maybe disengagement as a precursor, or does it happen after burnout happens? What does that look like?
That is a fascinating question. And I actually have seen very much a correlation, oftentimes between the emotional exhaustion component of burnout, as we talked about earlier, and engagement. In fact, I one time did a study with one organization. This was years ago. This was about a decade ago. Now, you recall a decade ago, we're coming out of the Great Recession. And so this particular organization, 3 years, no pay raises, double the effort to become more lean as an organization. And I remember I surveyed about 175 managers, if I recall correctly. And I assessed engagement and I assessed burnout. And what we found is that there was a correlation. It wasn't a super strong correlation. It wasn't even really a moderate correlation, but there was a correlation between engagement and emotional exhaustion, but not with the other components of burnout. So we can reach this point, in essence. This goes back to the very first question, I just think is great, where we can feel simultaneously engaged and feel exhausted in our work. But it's very hard to feel engaged in our work once we start getting into the cynical and the efficacy, the loss of professional efficacy. That's where we really don't see that correlation happen. So the way I described it to the company that I was working with was, you've got these managers who are essentially at the edge of a cliff. They don't want to go off that cliff. They want to stay engaged, but they're at risk of doing this. And so what we've got to do is we've got to figure out, how can we then treat the emotional exhaustion while keeping them engaged? And some of the methods that we talked about today were really helpful in that regard. So the short answer is yes, but really only with that emotional exhaustion component. Once we've gotten into the other components of burnout, we really don't see a correlation between engagement and burnout.
Very interesting. Okay. So in your research, how have you found the U.S. compares in their burnout with other countries?
There have been some cross-cultural investigations of burnout, and the US has more burnout than some countries do. For example, on average, there's more burnout here than oftentimes there is in parts of Western Europe, and in South America, there's oftentimes less burnout. But it's really complicated. Those cross-cultural ones, I don't lend a lot of credence to those, because we're not typically getting into that data deep enough to look at, are these blue collar versus white collar workers? What kind of industry? Again, industry and role make a really big difference. Not really generation and sex, but we do find that difference there between, between industry and type of role that we have. And so I really think the research is out on that question. We see the really broad levels of burnout. The U.S. is oftentimes higher than other countries are. It's not the highest country, but it certainly is higher than other countries are. But until we can really figure out what's going on there, it's hard to know if those differences are sampling differences or if they're real differences. And so I don't think we have quite conclusive evidence on that question yet.
Okay. A couple questions that I think will likely be our last that are coming from the management side of things. So one of those is specifically around control. What happens if complete opposite happens with staff. So they don't want to take any control, but they leave it up to the management, which in turn causes management stress or increased risk of burnout.
Yeah, it is a really great question. And sometimes we go back to those proactive employees, right? We wish all of our employees were just proactive, right? And the fact is we are going to have variance on that. So one of the things I think from a managerial perspective that we can understand is that there is this notion of role ambiguity. And so oftentimes when people are less willing to really kind of take control, is that they feel that there's so much ambiguity in the role they have. And by role ambiguity, what they're really not seeing is how their part plays into the greater whole. And so one of the managerial tips that we can have for people to take more ownership, and it's not like a cure-all, it's not a panacea, because there are just fundamental personality differences sometimes that we can't change as managers. But something we do have under our control is to help each individual see how their individual contributions or their individual role really aligns with what the overall team goal is. That's one of the greatest ways to be able to address that role ambiguity. The other thing that we can do when it comes to that as well is, again, that check-in method. A lot of times what we hear when they say, when they don't want to take control, is they need to be checked up on all the time. But one of the questions we can ask is, do you have adequate resources to do this? What's an obstacle? This goes back to the demands part. What's an obstacle in your way of accomplishing this goal that I can help take away from you? And so sometimes, again, it's that taking away part rather than just giving control. It's also, what can I take away from you that might be hindering goal accomplishment? So those two things may be able to help to individuals to, again, take more ownership and control. Again, I wouldn't say they're panacea because there's personality differences you can't control, but there are two tools at our disposal to help people take more control over their work.
All right. And for our last question, this is also going to be a manager who might be seeing their supervisees exhibiting burnout behavior. So other than taking those actions that you outlined for managers, what's the best way to encourage these individuals to do these individual actions to ease their burnout?
You know, one of the best ways we find from research is just modeling those behaviors. And so one of the things, for example, if we want to model, if we go back to any one of these, if we want to model the removing obstacles to progress, one of the things we find in research is that when supervisees, employees, see that we're lobbying to the organization to remove obstacles to progress, that can actually make them more likely to start working with determining what are my obstacles to progress and get them talking about those things. Or when they see us that we're creating and celebrating small wins, for example, if we're sending out a done list to the team, or if we're following a morning routine and we're really precise and we communicate about what the morning routine is, that can be a great way to do it. And on and on. But with each of these things, there just simply comes a modeling component to it. The other thing that we can do too, and this kind of goes to some of the other suggestions that were given earlier, is be very clear and communicate about what you are doing in this regard. And so just having that continual dialogue with them about what is it that you're doing, or what is it that you want to do, or what do they want you to open that up? What do you want them to do to be able to, again, kind of combat that burnout? So it's the dialogue in essence. So it's modeling and dialogue are the two major things that can help individuals to do these different, to incorporate each of these different skills as well to managing burnout.
Wonderful. Okay, so that actually does it for the questions then. Any final thoughts from you?
I just appreciate each of you being on here. I know that this is a topic that keeps me and others up at night. And so I hope that this is helpful for you. And should you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can connect with me on LinkedIn is often the best way to reach out to me. And so, yeah, I'd love to keep the dialogue going. Thanks very much for tuning in today.
All right. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great afternoon, and thank you for being here.